Good afternoon. Well, for me, it's afternoon. I guess it depends on where you are. You could still be in morning. I asked Ashley like 17 times if I'd be able to see faces once people entered because it's so hard. You all know as teachers, it's so hard to speak to little icons or muted cameras. It's like I need a recognition of something, facial expression. So I'm glad to see all your faces. Maryland, wow. All over the place. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started because oh, that's fine. If you don't want to turn on your camera or you can't, that's totally fine. That's absolutely fine. As long as I have at least one face, I'll just talk to that one person and that's okay. They'll get a very specialized conversation. Thanks for sharing where you're from. It's exciting to see folks from everywhere. I'm in Southwest Ohio. I've lived here for about 10 years. I don't say I'm from here because I'm in denial that I've lived here so long and I'm an Ohioan probably now, but that's where I live currently. I am a former classroom teacher and I've been with Inquire Ed since pretty close to the beginning. So I'm thrilled to be here and so many excited, enthusiastic educators. It's always like an honor to speak to people who are putting in the work of continuously reflecting and improving on their practice and thinking about shifts in education. So thank you for sharing this time with me. I'm Emery Lucas, for those who just joined. We're going to be talking about questioning today, student questions and content standards more specifically. So thinking about the role of questions in the inquiry process, not just as the name inquiry implies, but sort of speaking to some of the questions that I heard came up in the keynote this morning, in Shanti's keynote, about just sort of the rigorous expectations on teachers, social studies or any content area, to also obviously address your learning targets and hit standards while honoring student voice and inquiry in the process and student questioning. So that's my goal, is for us to talk about that and pull that together. And we'll get more into sort of some questioning protocols and conversations between you all in small groups as well. So lots of Chicago folks. It's exciting. Okay. So I'm going to advance here. This is a reminder of norms for large group. As we said, camera on or off is great. It's great to have at least a few faces to see and speak to. There will be some opportunities to share questions and thoughts in the chat. So please have your chat handy. I'd love to hear from you at some different moments of our conversation. And then we are going to be getting in breakout rooms today. I think you've been in Jamboard, maybe in some other sessions so far, so you'll be familiar, but we're going to have a lot of Jamboards at one point. So you'll be in a small group, and I encourage you, it'll actually, in fact, be part of the protocol that everyone is speaking up and sharing. So please, if you can, turn on your camera for that, at the very least, microphone on so that you can participate with your group. So we'll get right to it. Oh yeah, the Jamboard issue I think has been fixed. So we'll talk about that when we get there, but we should be. I heard about the saga. I was in a meeting and I was getting a bunch of chats, and then I opened up my chat after my meeting and I was like, oh, thanks for solving this problem, because I would have been panicking on the spot. So that's great. So let's start out. Speaking of questioning, I could have made a slide. In fact, I started to, that said the importance of students' questions and inquiry-based learning. And I stopped myself like, what am I doing? I'd rather start that conversation from you all. So you're all here because you have some value on inquiry-based learning and student questioning playing a part in that. So if you are able to open up your chat and just share to everyone a reason why you value including students' questions during an inquiry-based learning process at any phase, in any way. What's the value of them? Why are they important? Promoting engagement, absolutely. I'm seeing a lot of engagement. Authentic learning, student-centered, yes, 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 thank you. Keeping students in the process and ownership of their learning. Connection, oh, that's powerful. Yeah, absolutely. Connection to each other and the learning. Lifelong learning, yes, we're all questioners. I love that. Intrinsic motivation. questions drive the learning? Yes, I hope so. That's what we'll be talking about. Fostering curiosity. Yes, I love all of this. Enhancing their thinking. Yeah, students are naturally curious. Great point, Jared. That's so important. So we're capitalizing on that as we're building it into the process. And it sticks better. Yes, I love that point, Melissa. Like if it's coming from students' questions, they're going to hold on to the answer a lot better. So these are all great reasons. We all are finding value there. The question is like when and how to integrate questioning into the learning process in ways that are authentic to the point made above, give students ownership, and also, you know, we want them to retain, as that sticking point Melissa said, like we want them to retain what they're learning. And so if we're incorporating questions in the right way, maybe it's helping students grab on to the content and hold on to it, and not only making it relevant to them, but staying with them for longer. So all of the above, thank you for sharing those thoughts. I think you've seen maybe a slide like this already this morning, but you know, at Inquire Ed, we believe very strongly that questions drive the inquiry process. Multiple people said it a second ago. Let me try to move this chat out of the way for myself. Okay, I'm not very zoomy, but okay, I think that works. So yeah, questions driving the inquiry process, not just in the launching part of the process. Somebody used the word drive as well. And I don't think of drive as just getting in the car, you know, not just like taking off and turning on the ignition, which obviously is an important step, but also sustaining that investigation. So as students are moving through an inquiry process, it's not just that we're taking their questions at the beginning. How are we actually using those questions to help guide us and guide them along the way, so they continue to see the value of those questions? It's not like an exercise that was empty. Yeah, my teacher wrote my questions down, moving on. They're actually feeling like they're answering questions, they're checking in with them as a self-reflective tool. And then finally, like they're taking action, hopefully in an inquiry process or a project-based learning process. They're taking some kind of authentic action, and they're going to naturally, as Jared said, they're naturally curious. So they're going to have questions and ideas about how to sort of apply themselves in the world. And what we want to do is use those questions to also help guide that part of the process. So not just the content, you know, in the weeds of the classroom learning, but as they step out of the classroom. Somebody mentioned lifelong learning. That's action every day, you know, growing up and applying that learning as they move forward. So that's, I'm 100%, we're all like kind of on the same page in our intention. That's where we're going to be focusing today. So our goals, I sort of broke this into 3 goals for our time today. The first one is to unpack some question generation strategies. We're going to spend a lot of time on one in particular that we use a lot here at Inquire Ed, but we'll also talk about some others, and I'll share some other ideas with you. The second goal is to think about the role of teacher design and aligning those questions to standards and content so they are sort of meaningful expressions of the content and they're not empty questions. They're creating relevance, enhancing thinking. Cynthia said that. That's what we want. So how's the teacher's design supporting that? And then finally, thinking about some strategies for revisiting questions that support standards and learning goals throughout the process, so that it's not just like a launching moment, but it's sort of something we're revisiting and we're able to use them as educators meaningfully to sort of put students against the standards and our learning targets and see how those things are lining up. So how do we use questions, keep students' questions as a critical piece of that? Those are our goals. No big deal, right? We're just like, this goal is no problem. So first, question generation, natural place to start. We're going to watch this short video that is summarizing a process that we use, a questioning protocol that we use at Inquire Ed a lot, called the question formulation technique, or the QFT. This technique was actually originally developed through the Right Question Institute. We've adapted it for our curriculum, but it has a lot of applications and a lot of opportunities to further adapt it. So we're going to be using this protocol in a moment in small groups, and I'll be explaining the steps again. I'll make sure that we're all very clear. So don't worry, you know, you don't have to try to like memorize everything that's said. We'll talk more about it, but this will give you a little intro to the process. And hopefully my sound will come through okay, but let me know if not.
Hey there, Aaron here from Inquire Ed. The question formulation technique, often referred to as the QFT, was developed by the Right Question Institute as a simple step-by-step process that helps anyone produce, improve, and prioritize questions. It's a powerful strategy, and that's why we're here with a 90-second breakdown of how the QFT can work in your classroom. The QFT starts with a Q focus, the spark that jumpstarts the production of questions. The Q focus can be a statement, image, phrase, or situation, as long as it is clear and interesting enough to activate curiosity. One hard and fast rule, though, the Q focus can't be a question. Before you start producing questions, pick someone to write down and number the questions as they come. Then review the rules. Rule number 1, generate as many questions as possible. Rule number 2, do not discuss, answer, or judge any questions. Rule number 3, write down every question exactly as it is stated. Rule number 4, change any statements to questions. Take 4 to 5 minutes to produce questions using a timer to keep you on task. Once you're done, it's time to improve your questions. Set your timer for another 4 to 5 minutes, then categorize questions into open and closed, labeling each with a C or an O. Next, discuss the advantages and disadvantages of both types of questions. Finally, change one open question to closed and vice versa. Okay, only a few more steps. First, prioritize your questions, setting the timer for 3 minutes and placing an X next to your top 3. Don't forget to discuss why you've chosen them. Afterwards, take another 2 minutes to discuss and plan your next steps, describing what you'll do with your questions. Don't forget to reflect on what you've done and what you've learned. And that's a 90-second breakdown of the QFT. Now go ask some questions.
Okay, that's a sort of quick rapid fire summary, but just to review those steps, this technique breaks down into some timed steps. Martin, I think, mentioned earlier, we like timers around here, so don't worry. We're gonna always give time steps. And we're gonna do this actually in a Jamboard, but let me just summarize the steps that Erin explained in that video. So first, I'm gonna provide you a Q focus in just a moment, and that's a prompt to sort of trigger your questioning. You're going to produce as many questions as you can in your group. Everyone's just going to rapid fire create, that's sort of step 1, as many questions as possible. You're going to group your questions by thinking of them as open or closed. And I want to pause here for just a second, because that kind of happened quickly in the video. He said he had the little scale animation, you know, the advantages and disadvantages are open or closed questions. And I think it's important to point out, because I remember when I was sort of going through my own teacher training, it was a lot of emphasis on open-ended, helping students develop open-ended questions, and that sort of being a little bit like treated as a superior type of question to a closed-ended question. And I just want to call out for a moment that, like, maybe that's not always the case depending on what students are asking questions about. For example, if we were asking questions about a plan that we were developing to redesign a space in our classroom and build some kind of structure, we might have some really valuable closed-ended questions, like sort of what's the square footage we have to work within, and what's our budget, you know, and what kinds of materials are we allowed to use, and are there rules about how high we can build, for example. We may also have really valuable open-ended questions, like what's the purpose of the structure, what's the feeling we're trying to create. But I think it's valuable in a questioning process to not necessarily shut down or say that open-ended questions are better than closed. There may just be different values to different types. So this moment of classification will be a chance to consider sort of which of our questions are open and which are closed. And then in the next step, to possibly reshape some of those questions that are open-ended that might be better suited as closed-ended, or vice versa. So sort of switching one from the closed framing to more open framing, and vice versa. So that's those 2 steps of the process. And finally, as a group, you'll be prioritizing the questions that you think best help you like investigate that cue focus, that prompt in the very beginning with your purpose in mind. You'll pick the 3 or top, however many questions that you feel would best help you address that cue focus. So I'm going to show you the Jamboard here in just a moment, which will also have the cue focus written on it. But this is going to be our cue focus for our QFT. So since this session is about questioning, I'm prompting you to ask questions about questioning. That'll sort of help steer our conversation. So here's our cue focus. It's not a question, it's a statement. It's a spark of inspiration, a trigger for your questioning. So the cue focus is students' questions can be a powerful tool to promote ownership of their learning and deepen content understanding. That's my cue focus for you. So what you're going to be doing here in a moment, let me go over to this tab, is Ashley will be sharing a link to 2 different Jamboards. And if you are in an odd number breakout room, when you get sent to a breakout room, if your breakout room number is an odd number, you'll come to this odd number groups Jamboard. If your group number is an even number, you'll go to the even number Jamboard group, and you will find your slide for your group number. So all the slides are identical, but you're going to help kind of find your breakout room on that specific slide number. So let's say I'm in group 1, so I'm here on slide 1. And this is your Jamboard where you'll be doing your QFT, and you'll be self-timing this. So when you get here, one of the first things I want you to do with your group is to figure out who's the timer, who's going to help keep you on time. And if you think it would be helpful as a group, you could assign a recorder for the group. And that's up to you if you want to do that. Everyone can utilize the Post-it notes or sticky notes in here, or you could assign someone to try to capture everyone's questioning. But in step 1, you'll have 4 minutes. As a group, your goal is to record every single question you can, any question that comes to mind in response to this cue focus. So again, rapid generation. The goal here is not to edit, not to write good questions. It's just to get as many questions written down as possible. You can use the sticky notes. You can add more sticky notes. Everyone should be saying or writing, generating questions. Don't try to judge them or pick good ones. Just write it down. As long as it's a question, write it down. After 4 minutes of that, you'll move on to classifying your questions. So in that stage, we're still kind of in this top section of the board. In that stage, you're going to look back at the questions you've generated in step 1 and just label them with an O or a C, open-ended, closed-ended. And again, we're not hierarchically saying one is better than the other. We're just identifying where our closed-ended questions are and our open-ended questions. So those closed-ended questions that have like a definitive, short, simple answer versus more how, why questions would be the open-ended. And you'll just label your sticky notes right in this top section. After 3 minutes of that, you'll move on to step 3, where you're improving your questions. You're dragging some of those sticky notes from the top section down here, and you're trying to sort of improve any that would benefit from, instead of being closed, reframing it to be an open-ended, or instead of being open-ended, reframing it to be closed-ended. That's what, and you're going to move 2 sticky notes down here where you're just manipulating the question a little to try to improve it as a strategy. And if there's other ways you want to improve the questions, you could also do that. Finally, after 3 minutes, your final step of the process is to prioritize your questions. So you're going to look back at the questions from any of these other sections, and you're going to pull 3 down here that you feel like best help you address or zero in on your biggest burning, most essential questions about this cue focus, about this idea of students' questions being a powerful tool that promotes ownership and deepens content understanding. So as a group, you're picking your top 3 questions and dragging them into that section. When we come back to the whole group, after the protocol is over, I'll ask you to share out one of your questions from this step 4. So be prepared to kind of add that to the chat when we come back together as a whole group. Ashley is going to send you to your groups in a moment, but just a reminder, when you get there, you're either going to go to the even number boards or the odd number boards, depending on what your group number is. Oh yeah, you don't need both of them open. Yep, to that point. So you're finding your group slide. If you're even number, you're finding the even number presentation and then going to the slide number associated with your group number. Then you're going to set a timer Consider appointing a recorder. You don't have to do that, but whatever helps the generation happen. And then watch out for time reminders. Ashley will send them to the rooms. If you're in full screen, just a side note, you won't see them. So you may, if you're not in full screen, tell everyone else in the group that you're getting a reminder about timing. Okay, so we're going to get started with no further ado. Here's kind of a summary of the steps, but you'll be off here when we go, and look out for those reminders and generate questions. That's sort of the goal, as many questions as you can through the protocol. Welcome back. As you're coming back in to the main room, please share in the chat a prioritized question your group came up with for that final step 4. I'll put a little twist on this. Instead of sharing a prioritized question, if you want, or in addition to, in one word, feel free to share in the chat how this experience felt for you of participating in the QFT. So you could do both of those or either. So either share out a prioritized question that your group came up with, one of the questions that you feel strongly about that your group came up with, or also share in a word how this experience of participating in the QFT felt for you. Okay, scaffolding questions. Okay, what strategies do we effectively scaffold the prioritization process? It is difficult. Yeah, we'll talk more about that. But yeah, it's surprisingly difficult, but exciting at the same time. Okay, how do we get young learners to create questions? We're about to talk about that next, so that's great. What if questions stray from the topic you were hoping for? Good, let's talk about that. Strategies when they don't know what type of questions to ask, when they're struggling to ask questions, especially if they're new to the process, that can be a big challenge. How do we ensure students are answering their own questions? And more importantly, that they realize that they're answering their own questions, not just that they did it, but that they make the connection that they're the ones who did it. What kind of parameters do we give students? Ensuring all voices are heard, especially English language learners. How can we support struggling writers? So making sure all students are participants. So like kind of an equity questions I'm seeing about involving students for different reasons who might be struggling to participate. Transfer of information across content areas. Okay, these are great. These are great questions. Awesome. Thank you all so much. I do think it's important to point out right now I'm saying, great question. Thank you for that question. Good question. It's not something that I would be doing if I were facilitating step 1. Like if we were in person right now, we would have done this QFT. I don't know about whole group because there's a lot of us, but we would have done it, possibly talking out each step. And something I would have pointed out is my avoidance of sort of praising quote unquote good questions in the process, which if you've done a questioning protocol with students before, that may be something you've already decided to do, but you may be wondering why not praise questions that are being asked. And the reason is that it can support kind of a competitive hierarchy within students in the classroom, that if I'm saying good question to your question, all the other students in that group hear that. Right. And they're thinking, oh, write his question out. His question is one we should prioritize because she said it was a good question. So in those early steps of generation and prioritization of the process, it's really important that we're not sort of telling students which questions are good or bad. We're letting them come to that conclusion. I'm really like reflecting on Shanti's comments this morning about guiding students to draw their own conclusions. And like, I think in the questioning protocol like this, it can be very like democratizing in your classroom because you're letting students work out as a group what questions are quote unquote best. And this speaks to somebody's question in this chat that was sort of like, what if the questions stray? Or sometimes I get the question with this protocol, what if students ask like ridiculous questions? You know, like the kid who's like asking the funny question, like the silly question. How do you prevent against that? And my answer is, I don't try to prevent against it. I let the group work that out. I let the group's process of prioritization, let that question be, not comment on it, not judge it. let it be, but will it ultimately end up as a prioritized question? It's very unlikely or never happens. So these processes kind of work themselves out in a small group process like this if we trust students to help their questions guide the conversation. So I wanted to point that out. Thank you for these great questions, and I hope we dig more into all of these as we move forward. A couple other notes about differentiation, because I'm seeing this question come up a lot in the chat about sort of equity in this process, especially with young students who might be emergent readers or writers for any number of reasons. One is, this is a kind of a photo from one of our schools that partners with us to make this like question words poster, first of all, to help define question words, because really young students may just be defining what questions are, let alone asking like really deep or complex questions. The teacher can also be the recorder of the questions. So rather than having students write questions on sticky notes, it could be a whole class activity where everyone's sharing out, generating questions, and I'm just writing them down. And in the process of prioritization, I'm sort of starring or tick marking questions that students are repeating or feeling strongly about, without comment, right? Without praise, but being the recorder for the whole group. We can also practice a protocol like this that's not content-based, just to get started. So like, we're going on a field trip tomorrow, you know, we're going to the aquarium tomorrow. What questions do you have? And practice this protocol about something like a field trip where it doesn't feel as high stakes. That can be an entry point to a protocol like this that's a little more complex and gives students a chance to practice the strategy rather than focusing completely on, well, like, what step are we on and what am I supposed to be doing right now? And also, like, if I were doing this in person, I'd be asking you to hold up your sticky notes, share your prioritized questions. I'd be taking them out of your hands and clustering them on a board, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And one way I could involve students in this is involving them in that clustering process. So grouping similar questions that have connections to each other. And we'll talk a little more about clustering in a moment. Yeah, beginning of the school year, I love that idea. Like, here's how the cafeteria works. Ready for your questions. That's a great idea. I did want to point out, I believe this will be shared in a link, but it's also listed as a resource for this session, is this guide to student questioning, which has a lot of what we're talking about today broken down into some summarized protocol step-by-step instructions, which I'll kind of highlight a few of the parts of this as we move forward, but there's a lot of useful tools in here. So I'll be referencing page numbers in this document, which some of you are already in, as we're going through our remaining time together, just to help point out for you where you can find some additional information. Pages 2 through 9 specifically focus on the QFT. There's also like a Q focus development worksheet in there that kind of helps you develop a Q focus, which is something we're going to be talking about in just a second. So some other questioning protocols. We love the QFT here at Inquire Ed. We also utilize a protocol called a See, Think, Wonder. These next couple ones I'm just going to briefly mention start at page 10 in that questioning guide. A See, Think, Wonder is a process of providing a visual prompt and guiding students through first observations, then inferences, and then questions as a way to sort of break down their thinking. So you kind of circumvent that, like, I'm asking a question, but it's actually just a statement thing that young students tend to do a lot. So that's a See, Think, Wonder protocol. A KWL, obviously, you all know what that is, but that, I mean, that's another questioning protocol. What do we know? What do we want to know? And then reflecting back on, did we answer those questions? And you could organize the questions from a QFT into a KWL format. Take those questions and plug them into like a KWL graphic organizer or something like that as well. Also a Predict, Learn, Conclude, which is kind of similar, may have more of a scientific leaning, but what might happen to this, or what answer do we think we'll find to this question? And then once I've collected evidence, how can I use that evidence to draw the conclusions of the answers to my question? So someone asked, how do we get students to like kind of answer those questions and know that they've answered the questions? This can be a way to draw that out for them and help them see the connection by just revisiting. If we wrote down those questions weeks ago, pull that same piece of paper out that had our questions written down and almost annotate that same document with our answers. And I'll show a few more examples of that type of strategy in a few moments. So it's a little bit of an exploration of questioning protocols. I know that was the bulk of our time because I just think participating in that QFT can be so valuable, and hopefully you'll find some applications back to your own students and your classrooms. I do want to talk for a moment about the design, the teacher's design, and sort of coming up with that Q focus and aligning that to standards. There's more about this in that questioning guide. But I wanted to point out a couple kind of high level takeaways that I reflect on a lot when we're thinking about developing a really meaningful Q focus, like within our curriculum. For example, choosing the right prompt is obviously really important. And a lot of folks were asking about how can we get students to ask the right questions that are getting us to where we want to go. One thing I want to point out is that imagery can be really helpful, but it's important to think about sort of how that prompt is triggering questions in your students. So you can kind of backwards map this yourself by developing a Q focus, a proposed Q focus, an idea, a draft. And then you yourself asking questions in response to that Q focus, thinking like your students. What questions would they ask if I presented this with them? How am I queuing up the parts of this sentence or the parts of this image? So like in this example, if I showed students this Q focus A, like this picture, well, what I'm wanting them to do is generate questions about oral history. I don't know that they're gonna really like ask questions about oral history from looking at this image. Like, if I'm working with third graders, the questions might be like, why are there chickens running around? Like, why are they sitting, maybe why are they sitting in a circle, but like, what's that person doing in the background? Like, why are they all outside? Why aren't they wearing shoes? So what questions do I actually want students to answer? And then providing a prompt, even if it's visual, that points them to those specific things. The kind of counterpoint is like images can work. Here's an example of one that I think might actually be really effective. Here's this image of a frog's like life cycle. I could ask this in words, or I could make this Q focus in words. The frog's life cycle has multiple stages. I could name some of the stages, but it might be just as effective in this case to provide kind of a complicated, seemingly befuddling image if you've never seen this type of thing before, and get students to generate questions about what they're seeing. I might get even more specific questions than the question that the Q focus that I'm providing in words, because students are suddenly having to use their words to describe the image instead of me describing the image for them. So images can be very effective. A visual prompt can be very effective, but I would really encourage you to, like I said, put yourself in the shoes of your students and imagine what questions they will have in response to that prompt. And there may be some other way you can frame it or squeeze it in. I love this idea from Dory about placing two contrasting images of the same thing. That's really a compelling prompt to kind of notice those differences. What questions do you have? That's a really interesting idea. Yeah, text and image could be a possibility. Perhaps this as a caption to the frog picture. That could be really giving students a little bit of vocabulary, but ultimately letting them kind of grapple with what they're seeing. I love that idea. That could be a really compelling choice. Experiences could also be a Q focus. We talked about the field trip, or somebody said, we eat in this cafeteria. What questions do you have? So an event, an entry event, a hook activity can also prompt students with generating a lot of questions that you can then cluster. And we'll talk more about clustering here in a second. Models of student work can be a prompt. Looking at past work models or problematic models of work and asking, students to generate questions about what they're seeing and why this thing is made the way it is, or why it's working or not working. That can help students really identify skills that they might need, that you can sort of help shape into like a list of skill sets that they might need to develop to solve a problem or build something. So just that could be like a gallery walk activity, or different groups could have different models generating questions that are different from each other, and then finding the similarities between our questions across groups could be really compelling. Like, oh, you were looking at a brochure and you were looking at a newsletter and you were looking at a commercial, but we all had the same question about how to convince someone to buy something. So that could be a compelling sort of way to frame questioning as well. So I know that's a lot to take in. Some of those strategies, as I mentioned, are in that guide. So if you're scrolling through that guide or you make a copy of that for yourself, you'll see some of those examples called out with more specificity as well. And finally, I want to talk here about sort of not, like I said at the beginning, not just using questions as a launch to investigation, but how do we actually hold ourselves accountable for answering the questions that we asked? So I want my students to understand not only the content that I wanted them to get from those great questions that they asked, but I want them to know that they answered their question. It kind of falls apart if the next time we do this, I don't realize that that question I asked at the beginning of the week, I answered it at the end of the week. That's a very, empowering, for lack of a better word, realization for a child. So how do we make sure we're building that in and helping students make the connections between those discoveries? I've talked a little about clustering. Oh yeah, the questioning guide. We'll make sure everybody has that for sure. I talked a little about clustering. I think clustering ultimately gives ideas weight in the classroom. It's written down. I've put it in this big chunk with other questions, and I've sort of validated that it has like a right to be answered and that it should be answered. You could cluster students' sticky notes from something like a QFT or whatever protocol you're using. You could cluster ideas by topic, maybe that align to different standards or standard sets. And that might be effective if you already have a plan for how this unit needs to unfold. Like, you have to cover this topic in order for students to understand this topic. You really already have an order established. Just by putting students' questions underneath that pre-established order that you've already constructed in your lesson or unit development, just by putting students' questions in those buckets you've already made, you're maybe teaching the same lessons and doing the same instruction that you would have done if you never asked questions. But students feel all of a sudden in that small shift that you're teaching that lesson for the purpose of answering their question, not just because that's the unit and that's how we're teaching this content. So that simple act of saying, I've looked at all of our questions, we've clustered them on the board, here's how, and then the next day, here's how we're gonna tackle life cycles of frogs, guys, or whatever it is. We're gonna talk about this, which is gonna answer these questions. Then we're gonna move on to this topic, which is gonna touch on these questions over here. You, again, may already be the same structure you've already designed, but you're suddenly giving those questions weight and you're building them into the fabric of the process. If it's more older students and maybe they're going to do some independent research, these clusters can become research groups. They could become sort of interest topics for different kind of side independent work, or a little bit of free choice potentially if they're doing something like a web quest or something where students are going to be more independently driven. You can also help, like I said before, enlist students in doing this clustering. So it's like, which of these clusters do you sort of want to fit yourself into, and how can we fill the gaps in this cluster before we start our research? That might be a more appropriate conversation for older students, but it could still be very validating, especially if students are then have an opportunity to share out that research with the rest of the class in some kind of process. I love this question, if questions can remain unanswered. Thanks for asking that. I think sometimes that's okay. I think it's okay that sometimes we get to the end of a unit or a project and we say, you know what, we still didn't answer this. And then maybe we can come up with a plan, like how can we find an answer to this, or why couldn't we answer this, is sometimes just as good of a question as like, well, we didn't answer it. Like, why couldn't we answer that question? What was missing in our process that would have helped us answer that better? I think as long as we're not ignoring it and turning a blind eye, that can still be a valuable kind of reflection moment for students. Ooh, there we go. That was weird. Okay, so after the launch, that was sort of like getting started, right? After the launch, on pages 14 and 15 of that questioning guide, We break down a lot of these protocols that I've listed in a quick bulleted list here that might help you facilitate the revisitation of questions. Some of these are individual, or they could go to small group or whole class, and they're not mutually exclusive to these groups either. So something like a quiz or a writing task, and taking one of those questions off the board and just asking a student in writing or in a short one-on-one oral conversation to answer that question, or kind of reflect on how their learning has grown in response to that question, that can be very powerful on its own. And that could be their own question, but they go pick something off the board and say, this is a question I feel like I've really answered. Let me tell you what I think the answer is, or let me write what I think the answer is. Or it might be something like a quiz where you've taken this cluster of questions that you've covered in sort of this first segment of the unit, and you've turned those into written questions that students are then going to respond to, all at once. So I think we can kind of imagine what that looks like in sort of a traditional, here's the question, what's the answer way. Some other protocols that are fun that we like to call on sometimes are these small group protocols. Concentric circles is maybe my favorite one, where we set up students in two sort of circles of, one's a slightly larger and one is smaller, but each student has like a buddy, like an inner circle and an outer circle buddy. And you pose a question to the whole class. Take one of those questions off the board that we asked at the beginning of the week, and you're just going to talk about it. Excuse me. You're going to talk about it with your partner. You're going to just talk out your response to that question. And then after 2 minutes, the circles are going to rotate. You now have a new partner. Somebody moved down, or you move down one seat, and I'm going to pull a new question off the board, and we're all going to talk about that. That could give you an opportunity to do some great formative assessment too, walking around the room, listening to students' conversations. You might not hit every single conversation and every rotation of the circle, but if you go through a few rounds of that, students are getting to talk to different peers. They're putting ideas in their own words. You might notice which kids are sitting there staring at each other like, I don't know, do you know? That alone can be good feedback for you. So I particularly wanted to highlight that protocol. And mingle, pair, share is another one that's written in that guide. And finally, a need to know, good to go, which could be a whole class or small group individual. I have a little illustration of this one. Let's say we put all of those questions that we asked and they were up on a board or on a piece of chart paper, or however we've grouped them and organized them together. We can, as we're going through a unit, at the end of every lesson, we could just have a quick 2 or 3 minutes at the end of the class period where we say, we're moving on from this topic right now, but let's just real quick look at the questions that we had. And have we answered any of these questions? Like today, I'm pretty sure we answered this question. Like, didn't we answer this? What do you all think? And move it over from the we still don't know this, need to know side to the good to go side. Like, we've answered this question. We're all kind of agreeing that it's time to move this question over to the other side today. And like I said, that could be a quick daily exercise that's part of your routine. You could also take those questions that you've clustered, or individual questions, and they could each become sort of their own vision board of answering. So maybe we've taken that question about how does algae grow and some other questions, and we've decided all of these questions are under this topic that's all about algae. And we're going to attach to those questions our artifacts of learning, our research, some of the pictures we've been drawing, some of our discoveries, some things we've written down, some findings, and we're going to collect them on that chart paper that's devoted to that topic. And it's making our answering of the question very public. Again, honoring the student's voice and asking those questions, and a visual kind of reminder to students that that question has been addressed and that we all agree we've sort of like found resolution together. So that's just what this draft is representing. We're talking about a project, maybe not as content specific. I just wanted to throw this in. It could be skills based in the case of something like we're building or we're making something. Students can generate questions about that type of stuff as well. And I just wanted to show what that could look like. Like, same thing, we've sort of asked these questions and now we've answered them over to this side. Main idea and headings and subheadings. Such a great point, Jen. There's a lot of connections actually here, sort of in a meta way to like an ELA process of hierarchy. That's a great point. And this again is just showing individually students could do this. They could have two sides of a notebook. They could collect their biggest burning prioritized questions on one side. And as they answer them, sort of draw a line and sort of address, okay, this question I think I've answered. And that can be a journaling, very personal tool, or it could be something that's more, like shared aloud and shared in a small group. So those are just some different strategies. I know we're out of time. That was a rush. It's a lot to get through. I was talking really fast there. Before we go or on your way out, if there's a question that you answered today from your QFT earlier that you feel like you've really answered, I'd love for you to share it in the chat. An answer that you found to one of your questions, about whether it's about equity, meeting students where they are, including the right kinds of questions and keeping students on topic. If you have a response to any of your questions, I'd love for you to share it. And thank you again so much for this time. I really enjoyed it. Oh, wow, Jared. Oh, thank you so much. Warms my heart. Appreciate that. Thanks for nodding and being responsive. I saw you. I got you. That was great. Thank you all so much.